In a small hotel, one rule has been passed from guest to guest for more than 20 years. You can ask for any room you want, except one. Room 214. No one officially forbids it, and yet everyone who has spent a night there says the same thing. Never stay in room 214 after midnight. At first, I thought it was nothing more than another urban legend. I was wrong. My name is Victor. For several years now, I've investigated cases that no one has ever been able to explain. Every time I think I've reached the end of the story, and every time I discover it was part of something much bigger. When I first heard about room 214, I dismissed it as another story travelers tell each other. Every hotel has one. A haunted room, a guest who never checked out, a shadow seen at the end of a hallway. Most of the time, those stories fall apart the moment you start looking for facts. I expected this one to be no different. Then, I started reading reviews left by former guests. The first one simply said, "Avoid room 214 after midnight." I ignored it. Then I found another, then a third, then a fourth. They had been posted over nearly 2 decades, by people living in different countries. Some of them didn't even speak the same language, and yet they all repeated the exact same warning. My first explanation was simple. Someone had started an online rumor. Everyone else had copied it. So I checked the dates. The oldest review had been published almost 18 years earlier. The others appeared gradually over time without repeating the same wording. It wasn't copy and paste. It was as if every guest had experienced something, but none of them knew how to describe it in quite the same way. So I called the hotel. I asked only one question. Why do so many guests mention room 214? The receptionist laughed. The internet loves a good story. It sounded reasonable. So I replied, "Then I'd like to book room 214. There was a brief silence. Then he answered, "No problem." That evening, I arrived at the hotel. The receptionist handed me the key to room 214. As I turned toward the elevator, he called my name. I looked back. He hesitated for a moment. Then he said, "One last thing. If someone knocks on your door after midnight, don't open it." I asked him why. He stared at me for a few seconds. Then he simply smiled. "Have a good evening." The elevator stopped on the second floor. The hallway was completely silent. Too silent. Room 214 was at the very end. The receptionist had given me only one instruction. If someone knocks after midnight, don't open the door. I wanted to understand why. Before I even stepped inside, I examined the door. Nothing unusual. No signs of forced entry. No scratches. No detail that could explain the warning. I opened the room. Everything looked perfectly normal. A bed, a desk, a bathroom, a television. Exactly what I expected from a hotel room. I started photographing every detail. It was a habit of mine. When a case seems completely ordinary, it's often the photographs that reveal what the eye has overlooked. About 10 minutes later, I went back down to the reception desk. I wanted to examine the hotel's old guest registers. The receptionist looked surprised. Then he agreed. The records went back several decades. I was looking for only one thing. Room 214. At first, nothing. Hundreds of names, hundreds of nights, no incidents. My original theory seemed to be correct. Maybe this was nothing more than an old rumor. Then, I reached the oldest records, and that's when something stopped me. Several entries were missing, not torn out, not erased, simply replaced. Between perfectly ordinary reservations, some of the pages were photocopies. The paper wasn't the same, neither was the ink. It looked as though part of the register had been reconstructed years later. I asked why. The receptionist shrugged. The original records were damaged. The explanation sounded reasonable, until I noticed one detail. Every replaced page concerned only one room, room 214. I asked whether the original pages still existed. He shook his head. They were destroyed in a flood. I was about to close the register when a small slip of paper fell from between the pages. It wasn't an official document, just a handwritten note, only one sentence. Never assign room 214 after 12 a.m. No signature, no date. I stood there in silence, because only a few hours earlier, the receptionist had insisted that all of this was just an old legend. So why had someone working in this hotel written the exact same warning long before the internet ever existed? I looked up at the clock behind the reception desk. It was 11:47 p.m. I had 13 minutes left before midnight. I went back up to my room. It was 11:49 p.m. I locked the door. I placed one camera facing the entrance, a second one near the window, and a third one in the hallway. If someone knocked, I wanted to know who. The minutes passed slowly. 11:55 p.m. Then 11:58 p.m. The hotel was perfectly silent. At exactly midnight, nothing happened. I waited. 1 minute, then 2. I was beginning to think the whole story was nothing more than an old superstition. Then, at 12:03 a.m., 3 knocks echoed against the door. Slow, steady. I immediately looked at the monitor connected to the hallway camera. No one. The hallway was empty. At first, I assumed the camera had malfunctioned. I opened the feed from the second camera. The same image. A completely empty hallway. And yet, 3 more knocks echoed through the room. This time, they were louder. I walked toward the door. Without opening it, I listened. No sound, no breathing, no footsteps. Only silence. I checked the camera feeds again. Still no one. At that moment, there were only 2 possible explanations. Either someone was knocking on my door without appearing on any of the cameras, or the knocking wasn't coming from the hallway at all. I slowly stepped back and looked at the door one more time. The 3 knocks came again, exactly the same rhythm, but this time I realized something. The sound wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from inside the room. I froze, because only a few seconds earlier, I had personally searched every corner of that room, and I was absolutely certain I had entered it alone. I remained completely still for several seconds. The room was silent. Completely silent. Then I did the only thing that seemed logical. I looked for a rational explanation. I checked the bathroom. Empty. The closet. Empty. Under the bed? Nothing. There was no one there. But more importantly, there was nowhere anyone could have hidden. I reviewed the camera recordings. I wanted to find a mistake, a blind spot, something that could explain what I had just heard. The hallway camera showed exactly the same thing. No one outside my door, no one in the hallway. Then I looked at the camera placed inside the room, and that's when I noticed something. At 12:03 a.m., the exact moment when the first knocks had been heard, the recording had been interrupted. Only 3 seconds. Not a black screen, not a complete failure, just 3 missing seconds. I wondered if the camera had simply lost its signal. It was possible. But when I checked other moments where the connection had been unstable, the interruptions always lasted longer. Never exactly 3 seconds. I decided to go back down to the reception desk immediately. The receptionist was still standing behind the counter, as if he had been waiting for me. When he saw me approach, he didn't ask if everything was okay. He didn't ask what had happened. He simply said, "You heard the knocks?" It wasn't a question. I stopped. How do you know that? He looked down. A few seconds of silence passed. Then he answered, "Because everyone comes back here afterward." That sentence caught my attention. Not, "Everyone comes back here to complain." Not, "Everyone comes back here because they're scared." Simply, "Everyone comes back." I asked him how many people had heard those knocks. He hesitated. Then he pulled out an old notebook hidden beneath the counter. Not an official record, a personal notebook. Inside, there were dates, room numbers, and initials. Every entry was connected to room 214. I asked him what it was. He answered, "The people who asked to change rooms." I looked through the pages. There were dozens of names, but one detail immediately caught my attention. Almost everyone had requested a room change after 12:03 a.m. Not before. Not at midnight. Always 12:03. I looked up at him. "Why doesn't anyone talk about this officially?" This time, he took longer to answer. Then he said, "Because they never managed to explain what they heard." I thought the case was about a room, a door, mysterious knocks. But at that moment, I understood something. Room 214 wasn't famous because something strange happened inside it. It was famous because every person who stayed there ended up asking the exact same question. What is knocking from inside? I went back upstairs. Before leaving, I watched the camera footage one last time. And that's when I noticed something I hadn't seen before. During the 3 missing seconds, the video file had been automatically replaced. The file name was no longer the hotel's camera identification. It had a different reference, a sequence of characters, a code I had never seen before. MB01. The following morning, I didn't return to room 214. Instead, I went back to the screen displaying the recordings from my cameras. I wanted to examine the interruption again, frame by frame, second by second. The missing 3 seconds. At first, I assumed the camera had simply lost its signal. Electronic devices are not perfect. A weak battery, interference, a recording failure. All of those explanations were possible. So I compared that interruption with other recording errors from the same camera. I found several signal losses from previous investigations. None of them looked like this one. Whenever a camera lost connection, the image froze or turned black. Sometimes the video file became corrupted, but here one of that had happened. The 3 seconds hadn't disappeared. They had been replaced, as if the original recording had been removed and another version had been inserted in its place. That was exactly what had led me to discover the code, MB01. So I decided to verify something very simple. Who did that reference actually belong to? I started with the most obvious possibility, the hotel's surveillance system. I asked the manager about the camera manufacturer, the recording equipment, the software used by the security system. I wanted to know whether MB01 could simply be an automatically generated reference. A few minutes later, I had my answer. None of the hotel's equipment used that type of identification. At that moment, only 2 possibilities remained. Either someone had deliberately altered the recording, or that code came from somewhere else entirely. I went back to the receptionist. I showed him the code, MB01. I asked if it meant anything to him. He stared at the paper for several seconds. Then he slowly shook his head. "I've never seen that before." His answer sounded genuine, but something bothered me. Since the moment I arrived, every important question I had asked had been answered almost immediately. This time he had taken his time, as if he were searching his memory. I asked him how long he had worked at the hotel. 26 years. Longer than the oldest guest testimonies I had found. Then I asked him another question. Has room 214 always been room 214? He remained silent. Then he answered, "Not exactly." That answer changed everything. He explained that the hotel had been renovated several times over the years. Walls had been moved, some rooms had been expanded, others had disappeared completely. He told me he had never thought much about those renovations, until I mentioned MB01. At that moment, I realized there was only one thing left to examine: the original building plans. The manager eventually agreed to retrieve them from storage. They were covered in dust. The pages had turned yellow with age. Some of the notes had almost faded away. I immediately compared them with the current plans. At first, everything looked identical: the lobby, the staircases, the hallways. Then, I reached the second floor, and something caught my attention. Behind the wall of room 214, the old plans showed a small service room, a windowless space, accessible only through a maintenance corridor. On the current plans, it no longer existed, as if it had never been built. I asked why. The manager told me he didn't even know that room had ever existed. As far as he knew, that wall had always been there. I continued studying the documents. Then I noticed another anomaly. Not all of the handwritten notes had been written with the same ink. Some of them looked much newer than the others. Someone had returned to these plans years after they had originally been drawn. One sentence immediately caught my attention: "Do not reopen this area." It wasn't a construction note. It wasn't a maintenance instruction. It was a warning. But that wasn't what disturbed me the most. Just beneath that sentence, hidden in the corner of the page, was another inscription: NB01. I stood there in complete silence, because that discovery meant something very simple. The code hadn't appeared inside the recording. It already existed, long before that video had ever been captured. I asked the manager who had written the note. He didn't know. No name, no signature, no date. As if that annotation had always been there, without anyone ever noticing it. I photographed the plans. Then I returned home. For several hours, I compared every piece of evidence I had collected: the guest testimonies, the replaced hotel registers, the handwritten warning found at the reception desk, the missing 3 seconds, the MB01 code, the original building plans, the sealed service room. Taken separately, none of those elements proved anything, but together, they told a very different story. Someone hadn't simply tried to hide a strange phenomenon. Someone had tried to erase every trace that could explain it. Until that moment, I still believed I was investigating a hotel room. I was wrong. Room 214 was probably never the real mystery. It was simply the first place where someone had left behind the reference MB01. And if that code appeared here, how many other places carried the same mark without anyone ever noticing? That was the question that pushed me to continue this investigation. Because sometimes, mysteries don't begin when you discover something. They begin when you realize that what you've just found was only the first clue. Maybe room 214 was never the real mystery. Maybe it was only the first place where someone forgot to erase a trace. Because sometimes, the most important discoveries are not the ones people try to hide. They're the ones they accidentally leave behind. Did you notice a detail that I didn't mention? Or do you have your own theory about what MB01 really means? Leave it in the comments. I read every theory. And if you enjoy investigations into unexplained mysteries, don't forget to subscribe, turn on notifications, leave a like, and share this video with someone who enjoys hidden mysteries and unsolved cases. I'll see you in the next investigation.